introduction, Amy. And here we go. I should mention, I have never made a successful bow. I've made 3 that I'm practicing on, but we'll get there eventually. In any case, I just want to make sure I'm sharing the correct screen. This is the slide you're seeing.
Yep.
Looks
Okay,
good.
great. Hi, everyone. My name is Noah Teller. I'm in Laura Larios' lab at UC Riverside and also working for Sequoia National Park this summer as a burned area emergency response technician. Today, I'm going to talk about my project that I did field work for in 2019 as part of my dissertation, while I was also working as a biological science tech for the park there. And without further ado, here we go. So an essential part of understanding what this project was and how it played out is the concept of wilderness. So wilderness, as it is defined in the Wilderness Act of 1964, is initially established 9.1 million acres. It's now about 5% of US land area, with almost, about 750 wilderness areas across the country, and almost more than half of that wilderness is found in the state of Alaska, as it happens. Wilderness is chosen from federal land with minimal human imprint, opportunities for unconfined recreation, at least 5,000 acres, and some significant educational, scientific, or historical value. And the kind of definition in the law by Howard Zahnesser, who is a kind of foundational author and contributor to the Wilderness Act. So wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and who does not remain. So apologies for the gendered language there, but I think this quote kind of captures an attitude towards wilderness as a place where humans take a backseat to nature's development of how it's going to be. But most wilderness areas are established on the ancestral homes of indigenous people, it's important to recognize, who were often forcibly removed to establish these largely recreational areas. This is true of many national parks as well. And indigenous management before wilderness designation, like prescribed fire, hunting, and religious ceremonies, were then stopped in the name of preservation, as the mandate of wilderness is to preserve it rather than kind of manage it actively and adapt with the times. And so managers in wilderness areas are also always required to use the minimum tool. And this is not always synonymous with the minimum disturbance or minimum impact. And this can interact with management problems, including biological invasions, which is where I started to take a interest and where the Park Service has been working for several years. So exotic plants in general become invasive due to several interacting factors, including propagular pressure, it's just the amount of seeds that are arriving in an area, the traits of those invading species, whether or not they have a fast growth rate or some kind of anti-plant compound that they can put out in the soil. And then the properties of that recipient ecosystem. Often ecosystems with higher resources tend to be easier to invade. And so these are some of the factors that moderate the properties of the recipient ecosystem. Things like resource availability and disturbance can significantly affect how that recipient ecosystem responds to an introduction of an invasive species. And generally, areas of low exotic propagular pressure and limited resource availability are less likely to be reinvaded after being disturbed from invasive plant removal. So my objectives with this project were to determine whether the manual removal of an invasive grass, Holcus lanatus, has facilitated the recovery of diversity and species richness in post-removal meadows, and then to characterize the recovery of vegetation in those treated areas by species and functional type to see if those characteristics had differed at all. So a bit more about this species. It's a perennial bunchgrass that is native to wet meadows and riparian areas in northern Europe. And it invades similar habitats in North America and Australia. And adults can be very fecund, producing up to 200,000 seeds, about 90% fertility, which then mature within 10 to 20 days of flowering. So really quick life cycle, particularly when stressed. It can go through its life cycle very fast. And has the ability to, or its impact is it modifies stream flows through bank stabilization, and then also displaces our native grasses and forbs. It's also very poor forage for herbivores and pollinators. And so the context where we're looking at this particular invasive species is in the Kern Canyon of Sequoia National Park. So on the left, you can see the state at large, California, and occurrences of Holcus lanatus in blue. But we're talking about the southernmost national park in the Sierra Nevada range. It can be seen in the middle. And the Kern Canyon is this large north-south gouge right through the kind of eastern end of the park. It's a glacial canyon, I believe, and has very straight kind of features. So it's a really great place to set out an experiment along a north-south gradient. But before we get into that, managers in the Sierra Nevada network of the U.S. national parks have developed what they call a kind of top-down strategy. So while lower elevations tend to be heavily invaded by exotic plants, native plants really dominate above about 5,000 feet. The ratio is about 80-20 in some of our worst lowland areas, and then it really flips above that 5,000 foot mark to more of like a 20-80 in the favor of native plants. And so the theory behind this is that higher elevations have fewer successful introductions of invasive plants and harsher environmental conditions, thereby giving us this lower invasion potential compared to the more mild environmental conditions and significantly more introductions of the lower elevation areas. And so hypothetically, our positive outcomes of invasive plant removal may be more achievable at these higher elevations where we're less likely to see reinvasion. But an important question is to actually be able to test this. It's limited resources in land management, particularly in the federal government, mean that often they don't have the resources to go back and monitor the impact of the management treatment that they apply, or if they do, the monitoring can be pretty limited, as in just the raw number of stems that are being pulled every year rather than what species are coming back in the meadow. So in this project, manual removal began in 2008 and has continued for 14 years by crews of up to 17. So it's really quite impactful. Having been the crew lead on this project for several years, the meadows after the invasive grass is removed are completely trampled and torn up, particularly the wetter ones. And often there's bare ground that remains after workers are trampling the plants. And the methods are mostly consisted of using this hand tiller device, which is shown on the right here. And occasionally we use herbicide or solarization, spreading a tarp out to let the sun heat and kill. But those are pretty limited. It's really mostly this manual removal. So my questions on this project were, have the efforts to eradicate this invasive species, Holcus lanatus, in the Kern Canyon achieved recovery of biodiversity and species richness? And do the post-treatment plant communities ultimately resemble nearby plant communities, or nearby uninvaded plant communities, in terms of their species and functional composition? Onto my methods. I laid out modified Whitaker plots, which quantify a species area relationship with nested plots across 10 different sites, 5 of which were inside treatment polygons for Holcus lanatus removal, and 5 of which were inside control plots that were never invaded and never disturbed by invasive removal. And I then had 2 overlaid data sets, aerial cover in the 10 1 meter plots per site, and I had 50 points in here. Today, I'm going to talk about these plots and not the species richness and area relationship, as I'm still working on getting a statistical test to work for that data. So onto my results, looking at the composition between those 10 1 by 1 meter plots. Ultimately, Simpson diversity was not significantly different between our control plots and our treatment plots. And the species richness had recovered to comparable levels in our treatment plots as well. So the species cover is only moderately altered. So analyzed by individual species, we can see broad overlap in composition. It is significantly different between plot types, but the R squared is very small. Only about 3% of the variation is significantly explained by this by species distribution. Excuse me. In terms of functional composition, we see a similar trend. Significant differences again, but the R squared is very small, only about 4.6% of difference between these groups. In the treatment plots, we have a bit more exotic grass, a few more native trees invading, a bit more bare ground, and it looks like a bit more native rush. However, this is largely driven by single plots. Each of these kind of points is representing a single site. So it's really not a large trend. The vast majority of these plots are within the same space and really mutually resemble one another. So the conclusion that I'm taking from this data is that ultimately, in this case, passive restoration is working. The treated meadows are passively recovering both their species richness and their Simpson diversity. And while there's some moderate functional or compositional differences, the treatment sites are not being reinvaded or secondarily invaded. So my future areas, of course, I'm going to work on these species area curves to better understand, just better be able to test the differences between the two site types, and looking at treatment intensity data to see if I can see any differences when I divide the sites out into how many stems were removed from a given area. So it's important to acknowledge that the landscape today known as Sequoia National Park was the historic homeland of many different Native American tribes, and that ultimately they were removed in order to facilitate its creation. I have some acknowledgements to make as well of my coworkers, Rich Steele, Hayotiarks, Andrew, Athena, and Laura. All of these coworkers at Sequoia National Park helped me develop my interest in restoration science and inspired me to apply to graduate school and come back and do this project. Also my lab mates, and if anyone has further questions or would like to contact me, there's my email, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. That was concise. Does anyone have any questions? Janet? Fire away.
Hi there. I'm not going to turn my camera on because my lighting is even worse than Amy's this evening. But thank you, Noah, for a great talk. I was just hoping for, especially this audience might like to hear about just who some of the players are. In other words, what are some of the native species that are in the mix in these meadows who are recolonizing?
Yeah. So I can say that the let's see. The native sedge group is dominated by Carex lenticularis and Carex nebraskensis, Nebraska sedge. These are really tall and vigorous sedges that make up the bulk of, or the kind of, you can see on the right-hand side of this NMDS, there's a group of control plots that have a lot of native sedge. And so I have a thought that potentially these two species, because they have a lot of height and fast growth rate, that they may be either resisting invasion, which is why these control sites never had Holcus lanatus invade in the first place, or these are just like, or the sedges are being slightly altered by the disturbance and being replaced by some other species, including these forbs, grasses, rushes. In addition, let's see, I can say across the entire project that there were 93 different species, 86 of which were native. And let's see. Yeah, the bulk of the diversity is driven by a lot of native forbs. Trying to think of anything else. Yeah, all of the rushes were relatively even in their distribution and abundance in the wetter plots. Juncus bufonius, Juncus mertensianus, and Juncus navidensis. And these tended to invade, or excuse, not invade, these tended to recover in the kind of wetter and more trampled plots. And so you see native rushes are a little bit, are contributing to some of the difference here in the treatment plots on the lower right-hand corner of this permanova. Let's see, some of the exotic forbs that were invading, Chenopodium album was a relatively significant one. Find looking for another, excuse me. A lot of significant willow invasion, native willows by Salix exigua and Salix laevigata in some of the treatment plots. So I'm thinking there are a lot of willows that kind of border these meadows, and there's a possibility that as the disturbance from treatment occurs near these willows, they're able to send out runners and then kind of clonally expand into some of the meadow areas. Just a kind of guess based on that distribution. Let's see.
When you get a chance, Noah, I know that Peter Alpert had his hand raised, and I think he was trying to ask a question but was muted. Sorry for my voice, I'm a little sick.
Oh, no worries. Is that?
Yes, thanks for the talk. And I was wondering if there were any site effects or interactive effects between site and removal, and if so, how you might interpret those.
Site interactive, like kind of environmental variables around the sites, like
well, you had, I mean, just you had 10 sites, and so were there any site effects, and then did site effects interact with removal effects, and if they did, do you have a notion of why?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm answering this correctly. I paired each of the sites, so every treatment site had a control site next to it that was, as similar as possible to that site, and then they were laid out across a north-south gradient. And so that was trying to capture a little bit of difference in growing season in terms of when the snow would melt, since it's at a fairly high elevation and significant elevational gradient across that space. That also interacts with the availability of soil moisture. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, no, there's pretty much no difference between which sites recovered more or less based on these exposures to different environmental conditions. Each pair of sites were analyzed as that pair and recovered to resemble each other. So, I can certainly tell you there are a lot of treatment sites that had, let's see, a lot of treatment sites had native sedge come up over the years that the project went on. So, a lot of it was replaced directly by species with very similar functional characteristics, kind of fast-growing, grass-like, and it doesn't really seem like the less common species that you might find, one or two occurrences of in an entire plot that are contributing a lot to biodiversity and richness, but that you might expect to be potentially locally extirpated by a significant invasion. It seems that they all came back really well, and it also didn't really depend on where they were located throughout the canyon.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Other questions? Glenn Holstein? Do you need to unmute yourself?
Maybe one little bit of flavor I can mention before we go on is a little bit of the history of the area. A lot of these meadows that we're treating are post-grazing. So once this area, before this area was designated as wilderness in a national park, sheep were driven up here, cattle were driven up here, and used. This picture is of the Lewis pasture, and that is kind of the largest meadow that we did treatments in. And so while these meadows are, they contain a lot of native species, their existence and the way they look isn't necessarily kind of natural per se. It's the result of years of agricultural use before they were then taken over by the park and kind of managed to preserve what they look like at that point. So I didn't mean to preempt anybody's question, but please go ahead.
Yeah, the question I had is, after the treatment, did the cover of Holcus lanatus decrease, increase, or stay the same?
The cover of Holcus lanatus crashed. So I have been working with the Park Service to get a correct set of their actual stem counts. There was a lot of issues with data management on that end, unfortunately, and the data is very incomplete, so I don't want to do any statistical analyses. But what I can tell you from anecdotal evidence, having worked there for 3 years myself, is that from 2015 to 2016, most of the sites that were dense monocultures are now, you get one or two little clumps kind of off in the corner by 2019. And then I returned again this summer, and they're really working hard to find this stuff in most places.
So there's been a decrease of the plant that was the focus of the treatment. Since we were talking about the reduction in cover of Holcus lanatus, do you think that could have been the result of drier years, less precipitation?
I would say that if I hadn't also been there in 2019 when a significant, California's experienced a historic drought, of course, over the last 20 years, but 2019 was one of the only years that area actually received a historical average water year. So significantly more water than the last 10 or 15. And that's when I first saw these populations with very few plants left. Really, their populations crashing. So.
Thanks.
Go, Janet.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick, one quick question, Noah. I was just curious about your terminology in your conclusions. That I guess the passive restoration works, and and I guess I was thinking passive means that you don't do anything, and you did do something, you remove the invader, but I guess what you mean is that there wasn't any active like replanting of native plants in the meadow, and so just removing the invader and then doing nothing else. That's how you're defining passive restoration in this case?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that is actually confusing terminology. It's so there was an active effort to remove this invasive plant, but nothing was done then post disturbance to restore the meadows. So I guess I'm kind of thinking of this as like the disturbance that I'm interested in is the disturbance of the invasive plant removal. And so I think from that perspective, once the disturbance is removed, the meadows passively recover. But I think you're right. It's more accurate that, you know, invasive plant removal alone is sufficient to allow the native plant community to recover in these contexts.
Got it. Thank you.
Glenn? Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. I think you mentioned that you don't believe that these areas of meadow vegetation are historic or natural. I was wondering what your evidence for that is.
The evidence of this these areas not being natural. Yeah. So, well, I guess that's essentially historical evidence from the park's archives that this area has been used heavily for grazing, and these meadows were modified significantly by the grazing pressure that they received.
Were they there before the grazing, though?
The meadows were intentionally widened in order to allow grazing. So there, there were small pockets of sedge. Many of the same species were there, but areas where trees were cleared in order to create these large grazable areas.
This is from the Forest Service or from the Park Service, that their history, is that correct?
Yes.
Other questions? Peter?
So, do you think that this hand removal of Holcus is a viable strategy in the large scale to get it out of the meadows entirely? And does it, in these meadows, were stock prohibited from grazing? I don't mean, cattle and sheep. I mean, packers and, park personnel, their stock, their mules and horses.
Yeah, I would say that it's feasible in specific areas, limited areas where there are few other invasive species that could come in and secondarily invade, which was the case in this area. In particular, hey, I think there are a lot of people joining. I'm concerned about some of the same things happening again. I wonder if there's a way we can force mute everyone and make them ask to unmute.
You should be able to unmute yourself, Noah, but the problem is people can unmute themselves. So
Yeah.
I went ahead and deleted the links on Facebook and Twitter, the direct links. Yeah, sorry about that.
In any case, yeah, I think that in these cases in which we have really low reinvasion potential, it's a feasible strategy. And in particular, when the area is containable, it's really difficult for Holcus to climb 2,000 feet up a canyon wall. It's really unlikely that it's ever going to disperse up there. And so if we can eliminate it from using this top-down strategy, right? Let me find that slide. If we start at the higher altitudes where native plants are already dominant, it's much less likely for Holcus to be able to kind of expand and reinvade. It's much less likely for anything else to come and take its place. However, I would say in a lot of like lowlands, you know, in the, you know, for instance, in the California Delta, Sacramento Delta, there are so many other invasive plants in the area that simply manually removing Holcus lanatus across this really, you know, geographically large and kind of, I wouldn't say homogeneous, but pretty, you know, wet environmental conditions. It's just not going to be feasible on a large scale to do that. So this is really focused on, you know, if you have a place that's already pretty well protected and preserved, this is a feasible strategy to remove these invasive plants. And I'll say my instinct going into this is that having seen the amount of disturbance over the years I worked as a crew lead, I was really expecting there to be really large differences between the treated areas after they recovered and the control areas. I was really surprised by these results. So.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Glenn, do you have another question?
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any history of how long Holcus has been in that area? Was it introduced by livestock grazing, or is there any knowledge of how long it's been there?
Yeah, so we think that it was brought in, or it was first, I'm trying to find it. I think I had a slide, but I'm not sure. In any case, it was first observed by wilderness ranger Laura Pilewski in 2006. And we did some opportunistic spot treatments and surveys in the following years to 2008. And then once the full extent of the invasion was kind of realized, a more significant effort to remove it took off. So the area was frequented by people who were very familiar with the flora. And although no systematic surveys were being done, you know, rare plant surveys were occurring. And so, you know, trained botanists were in the area. And I think while it could have been there for, you know, 5 to 7 years prior, it's unlikely that it had been there for a very long time, you know, decades and decades. And yeah, my first guess would be stock, you know, stock droppings or contaminated feed.
Do you think there were any psychological benefits for these crews that went in there and worked on eradication in this beautiful remote spot?
Yeah, you know, it's pretty tough. So our primary labor was provided by a contractor called American Conservation Experience, which uses primarily volunteers to go out and work on conservation projects around the country. A lot of international students do it in order to kind of see America's beautiful wild places. A lot of students, kind of undergraduates do it like right post college or over the summer. But this is to say they don't have a lot of resources. They, while I had like a wilderness ranger station to live in, they had 15 people living in tents for, you know, 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And I think that we also need to definitely look at, you know, the kinds of exposure that we're giving to people who will ultimately potentially go on to do conservation work in the future. Because I think it was pretty grueling for these people. And I think while the Park Service doesn't have the resources to necessarily hire a crew of 15 people, we should also consider how many resources the contractor is able to provide and whether that's really fair to those students and workers. And yeah, I guess this is to say that while there are a lot of things to appreciate, it's hard to appreciate when you're working that hard and when you're not used to spending that much time in the deep wilderness. So.
Any more questions? I apologize for the Zoom bomb. Quite frankly, I didn't even think that was still a thing. It's been so long since I've heard of anything like that. And I apologize, Noah. It's never happened before. We do want to make this available to people. So I'm not sure that, you know, sending a link out to people privately or a password or something is you know, is gonna work, but we'll try to figure something out. And if anybody has suggestions, please let us know.
I will say, I think you can set up the meeting so that there is a waiting room and you have to be let in by the host.
So I mean, I could certainly do
But-
that, but I actually don't know most of these people.
Mhm.
So, I have to just assume that people who were in the waiting room are legit, because I don't have any way of knowing,
Sure.
unfortunately. So,
Well,
yeah,
anyway,
but you handled it very smoothly and calmly, so. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I don't know, Noah, were you at that seminar a couple of years ago, the botany department seminar?
you'll have to remind me.
Oh, well, you would remember, we had a horrific Zoom bomb.
Oh, I
Really
don't think I was
horrific.
there.
Yeah, so I think since that, at that point, they had not set it up so that other people couldn't share their screen, and they hadn't set it up so that people couldn't annotate. So we had a real nightmare. Yeah. That was horrifying. So that was several years ago, though. Anyway,
I do have one more question out of idle curiosity. What
Yeah.
are those pretty peaks behind you?
Oh, these ones. Let me remember. Okay, this is definitely in Colorado. I did a season as a wilderness ranger there in 2014. And I'm pretty sure this is on the 4-pass loop around Aspen, White River National Forest. But I couldn't tell you what that peak is.
other questions? Okay, yeah, please send us your suggestions for preventing somebody from jumping in and making loud noises.
Yeah, I think one thing that we did differently was that we posted the link directly, and it was just kind of testing to see if we'd get more people, but I should not have done that. In the future, I'll just do the MailChimp link. So
Okay.
I think that
yeah.
was the issue.
Okay, all right. Okay, hopefully. And anyway, in the meantime, thank you again very much, Noah. We look forward to hearing that you are Dr. Noah. And also to years of your restoration work, making a really big difference in our native habitats. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in a month. Yeah. Take
Thanks
care.
all.
Thanks so much, Noah.